On this week's podcast, I had the pleasure of talking to my friend, ophthalmologist, Dr. Chris Knobbe, and we talked about seed oils. It's a topic I've spoken about many times in the past, but I think it cannot be talked about enough because by my estimation and Chris's, these are probably the single greatest driver of chronic illness in humans today. Yes, greater than sugar, as you will see in this podcast. And we talk about some very interesting observational research to corroborate that assertion. And so if you do one thing, getting rid of seed oils in your diet or significantly limiting them, I believe will make a massive impact on your overall health. So that's why this conversation with Chris is critically important. That's why I think talking about seed oils is important. These are corn, canola, sunflower, safflower. So enjoy this conversation with Chris Knobbe. You will learn a ton. We dig into a lot of the science, but it's not overly scientific as some of the previous podcasts on seed oils have been. Regardless, the take home here is get rid of seed oils in your diet completely. Corn, canola, sunflower, soybean, safflower, all that kind of garbage. And as you guys know, a diet of animal foods, meat, and organs, either fresh or desiccated, like we make at Heart and Soil Supplements, will be very helpful. I think fruit is probably the least toxic plant food, but that's an animal-based diet, and I've talked about that in the past. So enjoy this podcast with Chris Knobbe. Chris Knobbe, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you having me on. It's a pleasure.
Dr. Chris Knobbe, my mistake. Doctor. Welcome, doctor. So
I don't let anybody call me doctor, Paul.
We've done a couple of podcasts together, but for people that aren't familiar with your background, just can you introduce yourself and your background, and then let's just jump into some ophthalmology stuff from the start.
Okay, sure. So I'm a physician, ophthalmologist, had a full career in ophthalmology, and I am now a nutrition researcher as of the past about 8 years. I left practice in 2015 to pursue the hypothesis that processed foods and vegetable oils are the drivers of age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And so I went down that path, Paul. Published a paper, went public with that in 2016 and 2017, started a foundation. And then by 2018, 2019, I just was so convinced that I was seeing so much evidence that the vegetable oils are the primary drivers of obesity, overweight, and virtually all chronic disease. And I just didn't feel it was being covered very well. So I began to investigate that really in 2018 and went public with that in 2019. And that's kind of where I've been ever since, and just published a book, a new book. It's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. Just came out last week. There we go. There's a picture of it Paul's holding up. And so that's basically my story in a nutshell.
So this is really interesting to me, Chris, because as an ophthalmologist, I think the first question is, what is an ophthalmologist? Somebody that spent, how many years were you in practice? 25, 30?
Yeah, 25.
How does an ophthalmologist get interested in seed oils? And I think the connection there is this condition, macular degeneration. So let's talk about macular degeneration for people. My father just had surgery on his lenses for cataracts, which is not the same as macular degeneration. But when people's eyes go, it significantly affects our quality of life. So you mentioned something. You mentioned that age-related macular degeneration, AMD, is the leading cause of blindness or reversible blindness in adults over the age of 50. So it's a big deal in the world.
Right. And, just so people are aware, many people really believe that my path through all this was that I went down the path of trying to figure out what the cause of macular degeneration was, and then went broad and applied that to chronic disease. And that might be a more romantic story if it were, but that's really not what happened. I in 2013, when I read Weston Price's research, I understood that it was mostly, refined flours, refined sugars, vegetable oils. He included vegetable fats, he called them, as part of the processed foods driving all the chronic disease. So I was convinced by 2013 that that processed foods and sugars and vegetable oils were a big, they were the problem with chronic disease. And so then I applied that principle to look at macular degeneration. And that's what we did. So I investigated that for about a year and a half while I was still in practice. And I was so convinced that hypothesis held water that I left my practice to pursue this full time, because I knew it would probably take me, 7 years or so to figure that out if I was in practice. But instead, went on a full-time basis. It took me about a year, me and some colleague researchers, about a year and a half. And we investigated that data, looked at sugar and vegetable oil consumption versus macular degeneration in 25 nations. And Paul, the data, which I published in the scientific papers, the first time that, this has ever been done, that this hypothesis was proposed, was from our paper in November 2017, published in Medical Hypotheses. And in every single country, the big driver, it's clear, is vegetable oils. And in one of those countries, one of the things that bothered me about the research initially was the fact that in one of the Pacific Island nations, Kiribati, the sugar consumption was really high, or, at least moderately high by the world standards. But their vegetable oil consumption was extremely low, practically zero, and they had virtually no macular degeneration. And so this bothered me at first because I thought, sugar has to be driving this. And it was one of those moments I thought, I don't want to publish this research, that piece of it. I'm like, I want to cherry pick this data and we'll present 24 of the nations and leave out the one. And then the more I thought about it, I kept thinking, well, no, wait a minute. The problem is maybe sugars are okay. Maybe they're not the problem. Maybe it's the vegetable oils. And eventually, and I just kept investigating, and we published all the data, and I published a book on this, and I started a nonprofit foundation. And then, as I said, then I began just looking at this at more and more and more detail in regards to obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's, you name it. I'm interested. Like what are the mechanisms? What's the data? And as you can tell from my book, and you've seen what I've done before, I'm a data junkie. And so I look at all this data and try to make sense of it. And so with that, with that background, that's how I got into investigating vegetable oils essentially as a big driver of all this disease.
And
I want to know this stuff just like you do, Paul, and just like most people. I want to know it for myself, for my daughter, my family, and then for the world. So, I started this very selfishly to figure out, what's good for me, right? And then here's where I am, 12 years later, essentially.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you're doing this work. It's something that it's been fun to have conversations with you and share information over the years. And so I think that we will go through some of that data, and the associations are compelling. What's tricky about seed oils, and they're often called vegetable oils, perhaps more accurately called seed oils. And what we're talking about, if people are new to this podcast or new to this concept, are oils from the seeds of plants, things like corn oil, canola oil, safflower, soybeans, sunflower oils. What other oils? Peanut oil, grapeseed oil. These are the common oils, with canola, sunflower, and probably soybean being the most commonly used, perhaps not in that order. Corn is in there as well. And I would think palm oil is basically a seed oil as well because of the way that it's refined, bleached, and deodorized, perhaps. So these are interesting foods, if you want to call them that, in parentheses, to come into the human diet. And we've talked about this on a previous podcast in which you talked about the history of all of this. These are foods or substances, perhaps, compounds that humans were really never in contact with before the last 100 years. And so there are some really compelling associations between the inclusion of these compounds, these substances, which were previously used as machine lubricants in the late 1800s, something I've talked about in the past, and the increased incidence of disease in humans over the last 100 years. Because what is difficult to debate in any way, shape, or form is that humans have gotten much less healthy in the last 100 years. So I think that as physicians, all physicians, you and me both especially, are asking this question: what the heck is driving chronic illness? And there are a lot of possibilities, but I think seed oils are certainly one thing to consider. And as you said, age-related macular degeneration, something that is associated with your specialty ophthalmology, has also gone through the roof. So let's just start there briefly. If you can describe what macular degeneration is and what you see as the best evidence to link seed oil consumption with macular degeneration. And then I want to talk about, what is it called? Carboxymethyl pyrrol, because I'd never heard about this before reading your book. And that is very interesting in the retinal pigmented epithelium.
Okay.
The medical community failed me, but my life has now turned around. Check out this review on Whole Package from Heart and Soil Supplements. Derek says, for 3 years, I've struggled with depression, anxiety, panic attacks, night sweats, lack of energy, and the inability to gain weight. I'm a 33-year-old male with severely low testosterone. I started this supplement less than a week ago, and my life has already turned around. I have energy and, most importantly, mental clarity. I'm free of depression and anxiety. The only thing I've changed in my diet is taking Whole Package from Heart and Soil Supplements. I look forward to seeing even more improvement as time goes on because I've already had a positive effect. The medical community failed me. They had no idea what was wrong with me. And after multiple blood tests, it came back that my testosterone was dangerously low. Thank you, Heart and Soil, for turning my life around using these supplements. So these kind of reviews make me so happy. I'm so proud of what we do at Heart and Soil, getting people organs like testicle, which is in Whole Package from Heart and Soil Supplements, in ways that are easy and convenient. Getting organs in your life is incredibly important for optimal human health. And I'm so proud to have built Heart and Soil so that more people can get the nutrition from organs and feel better in their life. You'll find us at heartandsoil.co, where you can find Whole Package and all of our supplements, which are made from grass-fed, grass-finished organs from cows in New Zealand. They're all packaged in a glass bottle because plastic is bullshit. Find us at heartandsoil.co. Reclaim your birthright to radical health.
Yeah. So if you look at the history of age-related macular degeneration, AMD, this is one of the first things I did because obviously, if this disease is driven by processed foods, then when we didn't have any processed foods or they were extremely low, AMD should have been rare. And indeed, that's what I found. And this literally took months of research. But I ultimately determined that there were no more than about 50 cases of macular degeneration in all the world's literature between 1851, when the retina was first visible because of invention of the ophthalmoscope, and 1920 or 30. In that roughly 80-year period, there were no more than 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature. And most all of those came in the 20th century. There was just a handful of cases literally in the 19th century. And the ophthalmologists were describing that there was immense evidence that they were looking at the retina, and they had photographs and images and drawings and all that, but there weren't any images of macular degeneration in the 19th century at all.
What do you think is the best evidence that we have that vegetable oils are driving this?
Yeah. Okay. So the best evidence. And, we have a paper that's slated to be published, I hope, and another paper. And in this paper, we've taken data from 20 nations, and we plotted that versus average seed oil consumption for a period of 25 or more years. So if we didn't have 25 or more years data, we weren't plotting those two together. And this is in the book. But anyway, and then we analyzed that data to look at, the correlation, and using the R Pearson correlation coefficient, the number is 0.78. So that's a very high correlation between vegetable oil consumption and macular degeneration. Now, if we get into the nitty gritty detail, that's extremely complicated. But I can talk about some of that if you want to.
Get nitty gritty. I think we got to get scientific. Maybe just before we get into that, just tell people what macular degeneration is. You mentioned the retina, the back of the eye, but a lot of people don't even know what the macula is. And it's something that I didn't know before I went to medical school either.
Right. Okay. So the macula is the central retina. It accounts for about our central 10 degrees of vision. And just as the name AMD implies, this is a degenerative disorder. And what we see in macular degeneration is many things, but we see loss of retinal pigment epithelial cells. And these are the cells that support the photoreceptors. The photoreceptors are rods and cones. And that's what ultimately is required is to see. So we have loss of the RPE of the retinal pigment epithelial cells. Each one of those cells supports about 30 photoreceptors. Neither of these are regenerative. All right. So if you lose them, they're gone forever. I think of it like having a stroke or having a heart attack. Once those neurons or once those muscle cells are gone, they're gone. They're replaced by a scar. They're gone forever. So you have that. You have this damage to the retinal pigment epithelium. You have thickening of Bruch's membrane, which separates the blood supply, the choriocapillaris. So the separator between that choriocapillaris and the retinal pigment epithelium is the Bruch's membrane. And Bruch's membrane thickens and calcifies in a way that is analogous to exactly what we see in an atherosclerotic plaque, or they're very, very similar. And I'm not the only one that's making this comparison. This was made by others, not me. So you have that going on, and so this creates a barrier. Well, this is the barrier where there's nutrients exchanged between choriocapillaris, the vascular supply, and the retina proper, right? So you have that going on, and then you have all these other many other factors, like all the fat soluble vitamins are involved. So if you have deficiencies of vitamins A, D, K2, all of those are either drivers or hypothesized to be drivers. We're the only ones that have hypothesized that K2 is an issue because Bruch's membrane actually, as I mentioned, it calcifies, much like you get calcification in coronary arteries with heart disease. You get calcification in Bruch's membrane as the disease progresses. But ultimately, what people need to know is that these mechanisms all come together in a unified way to produce damage to the retinal pigment epithelium that then atrophies or dies. These cells die, and we lose those, and that's geographic AMD or atrophic AMD, and that's the dry form of the disease. And then Bruch's membrane can actually crack and break, and vessels can grow up through Bruch's membrane underneath the retina, bleed, and this is wet AMD. And this is where you have this disastrous loss of vision. But either way, you can end up blind. And, so we go back to that data. I mentioned that there was, no more than 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature between 1851 and 1930. Well, by 2020, 196 million people were affected with AMD. And by 2040, it's expected to be 288 million. And by 2006, 14 million people, the World Health Organization has shown, were either, had severe vision loss or blindness bilaterally. So in other words, these are people that are, for the better part, blind, either bilaterally blind or bilaterally severely vision impaired. 14 million people, that's an extraordinary number when you think about, well, we didn't have any more than 50 cases of AMD for a period in history of 80 years, right? So all this connects together. And now it's not just vegetable oils, but it's all the processed foods together, just like all these other chronic diseases, in my view.
Yeah, I want to show this graph from your book. This is the graph showing the correlation between the incidence or the prevalence of age-related macular degeneration on the y-axis and the average polyunsaturated oil consumption in grams per day on the x-axis. And again, the Pearson correlation coefficient is 0.78, which is a pretty strong correlation. And the outliers tend to be, I would say, above the line of best fit, Chris, rather than below the line of best fit. And why I'm pointing that out is because there are countries where there is increased prevalence of age-related macular degeneration, but there are very few countries where there is less. I would say there are more countries where there's more age-related macular degeneration than you would expect, rather than countries where there's less age-related macular degeneration for any given amount of polyunsaturated fat consumption. So that's a very compelling correlation. And there are other correlations. I've spoken about other studies. I'll put a couple of studies on the screen on YouTube for people here that I'll get after the podcast. There are other studies looking at this correlation and showing very strong correlations in more specifically studied populations in the United States. So this correlation between seed oil consumption and macular degeneration is very strong and is compelling. It certainly begs it's a very strong hypothesis. Now, these are all correlations. There's no data. No one's ever done a study where they gave people seed oils and looked for macular degeneration. This would be a very difficult study to do. But I think there are some compelling mechanisms that you discuss in the books and I was wondering if you could talk about carboxymethyl pyrrol or carboxyethyl pyrrol, excuse me, because this is really interesting. This is one of these breakdown products of linoleic acid. So there's linoleic acid, which I'll just explain for people, is an 18-carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. When we say polyunsaturated fatty acid, that's a mouthful. We'll often abbreviate that PUFA or PUFA. And of those PUFAs, the one we think about the most is linoleic acid. So when we're looking at the percent of linoleic acid, not to be confused with linolenic acid, or more specifically alpha linolenic acid, which is an omega-3, we're talking about omega-6 linoleic acid. We're looking at the percentages of that fatty acid in the oils of certain seeds. And we'll talk about different seed oils and how much linoleic acid they have later in the podcast. But this linoleic acid is a very unstable fatty acid. That's not really debated. That's an organic chemist's proof. You can prove that with organic chemistry, that the more double bonds a molecule has, the more unsaturated a fat molecule is. And when there are more double bonds and the molecule is more unsaturated, then you have more instability at the level of electrons attacking these double bonds, kind of organic chemistry complexities. And so this linoleic acid can break down into products, and we call these oxlams or oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism. I've spoken about 4-HNE on a previous podcast with Tucker Goodrich and Jeff Knobbe, but I'd never heard of this carboxyethyl pyrrole until I read your book. So what is CPE? It's one of these breakdown products, and why is it so interesting, Chris?
Yeah, so really there's, now I call these advanced lipid oxidation end products, these products that come from linoleic acid that are initially, converted to even physiologically or in the body or pathophysiologically, we might say, in the body. The linoleic acid reacts with radicals like hydroxyl radicals, for example, and the first product of that is lipid hydroperoxides, which are they're very unstable and they break down quickly. So they don't really cause damage, but they break down into these advanced lipid oxidation end products, or ALs, I call them. And these are chemicals like 4-HNE that you just mentioned, malondialdehyde or MDA, carboxyethyl pyrrole, acrolein. And then you have the what I call the oxlams, 9 and 13 HODE. That's hydroxyoctide decadienoic acid. But anyway, and then there's literally hundreds of others, Paul, and that's the reason I wanted to point this out, is that I compare this to like cigarette smoking. When you smoke, when tobacco is burned, you create more than 6,000 chemicals. And when you consume vegetable oils, you ultimately have breakdown products that end up with hundreds of chemicals. So these few that we're naming, these are just the ones that we know that are associated with a lot of damage, and they certainly are. But with regard to carboxyethyl pyrrole and macular degeneration, first of all, I don't know that this is a major player, Paul, but it is a player. Like I said, and there's many, many, many arrows all coming together, with regard to macular degeneration. But with carboxyethyl pyrrole, we actually know that this molecule is creating autoimmunity in some people. And so this breakdown product, carboxyethyl pyrrole, then can cause CEP, we've shortened that to CEP, CEP-related antibodies. And so those antibodies then can cross-react with antigens in the retina. And this may be part of macular degeneration. So there it is. That's in a nutshell.
And CEP is CEP, that's carboxyethyl pyrrole. Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting to me with these breakdown products of linoleic acid, whether we're talking about 4-HNE, 9 and 13 HODE, these names are very esoteric. Acrolein, which I want to talk about in a moment, carboxyethyl pyrrole, CEP, malondialdehyde, Now, these, at least in the case of 4-HNE, that doesn't come from anywhere except the breakdown of linoleic acid. And so this is a very compelling argument to me. Is there anywhere else in the body that you would get CEP from? Is carboxymethyl pyrrol coming from anywhere else in the human body, or is this exclusively from the breakdown of linoleic acid?
To my knowledge, it's exclusively from breakdown of LA.
And what's interesting about linoleic acid, backstory for people if they're not familiar, is that in the human body, we accumulate polyunsaturated fatty acids. We store these for better or for worse, often for worse, because I think that we are in an evolutionary situation where we're getting too much of them. But humans can interconvert saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And our body will make saturated fats, the fats that are supposed to be bad for us. We're going to talk about saturated fats and the liver later in this podcast. But our body makes saturated fats. And our body can interconvert those saturated fats with monounsaturated fats. And just so people understand, saturated fats are a string of carbon molecules, essentially with a different molecule on the end. And all those carbon molecules are bound by single bonds. An unsaturation is a double bond. So a saturated fat is all single bonds between the carbons in the fatty acid tail. And so our body can put one unsaturation into a saturated fat to make a monounsaturated fat. And there are multiple monounsaturated fats that are used in the human body for signaling and membranes. But our body doesn't make polyunsaturated fats that well. It has to start with raw materials. We can't introduce multiple double bonds into a molecule. So we need some polyunsaturated fats. But I think that the hypothesis that you and I are both suggesting is that evolutionarily, we are now getting increased amounts of these polyunsaturated fats, and past a certain threshold, they become problematic for humans. They're just not that available in, quote, nature. Hunter-gatherers, and this is something that you pointed out to me, don't have a lot of polyunsaturated fats in their diet because they're really only present in nature in nuts, which are seasonal. And as we know, our hunter-gatherer ancestors don't eat a lot of nuts. So maybe you can talk a little bit. I want to come back to the breakdown products in a moment, but this is probably a good moment for you to talk to us a little bit about what you've learned about how much linoleic acid is in our diet today as westernized humans versus what we know about the amount of linoleic acid in our ancestors, whether it's extrapolated from indigenous people who are currently living or anthropology, people like the Hadza or other indigenous groups. So that's a very interesting distinction for people to understand. And the whole framework of this is that when we have excess amounts of polyunsaturated fats, they accumulate in the human body. And we'll talk about this also in the podcast. It takes us probably 2+ years to get rid of them based on our physiology.
Right. So if we look at omega-6 linoleic acid in the American diet through history, I think is critically important because we know that, as you and I have talked about, and many others have talked about, that, for example, coronary heart disease was virtually unknown in the 19th century. Alzheimer's disease was unknown. Macular degeneration was extraordinarily rare. Dementia was unknown unless it came from syphilis. Obesity was 1.2% in men age 18 to 80. So what were we not consuming? And the answer is that, well, we had extraordinarily low levels of omega-6 linoleic acid because we didn't have any seed oils in the diet until right after the American Civil War. Beginning about 1866, we got cottonseed oil. That was the first seed oil that Americans had ever seen, and they weren't really ready to accept it. But what we did was, let's get back, staying with the omega-6 theme, is that we modeled the diet of Americans in 1865. And you could do this too. This is not that hard to do when you have things to help you like chronometer, and about the amount of LA in grass-fed meats and milk and purely ancestrally raised animals and all that. So we looked at this 1865 Americans, and they were consuming about 2.2 to 2.6 grams of LA per day. Now, in the book, I use the figure 2.2 grams, which is about 1%, but it might be 1.1%. We're splitting hairs here, okay, in terms of the omega-6 linoleic acid consumption in 1865. All right, at that point, we had no vegetable oils. We were phenomenally healthy. 1909, we know the next data available comes from Tanya Blasberg, and we know that by then we had a little bit of cottonseed oil and we had soybean oil, we had about 9 grams of vegetable oils per day, and our total LA consumption had doubled. There's the graph. So we were at 2.4 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid in 1909. That's 2.23% of consumption, right, of total calories. And if you go clear to 1999, you can see that we're just increasing with our vegetable oil consumption during this time. In 1999, we're at 18 grams of LA. That's 7.21% of total energy. And then by 2008, we're at 11.8% of our total calories, 29 grams a day of omega-6 linoleic acid alone. So we went from 2.4 grams or 1.1% in 1865 to 29 grams or 11.8% of calories in 2008. Now, if you look at, I've looked at all these, ancestrally living populations, like so let me name them, just several. So like the Maasai warriors who consume milk, meat, and blood, and their diet is 66% animal fat, all coming mostly from milk. Their diet is 1.7% omega-6 linoleic acid. I looked at the Tokelauans, who had a 50% saturated fat diet. Their diet is coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. Their consumption, though, was, even with a 50% saturated fat diet and 56% total fat diet, their consumption of omega-6 linoleic acid, 1.6% of their diet. I looked at the Papua New Guineans of Tukasenta, who had a diet of more than 90% carbohydrate, all based on, almost all they eat is sweet potatoes, and they occasionally would feast on pork and chicken. Their diet, which is more than 94% carbohydrate and 3% fat, was 0.6% omega-6 linoleic acid. It's similar situation for the Catawbans, for any ancestral population you want to look at. They're all less than about 2% if they're on their native traditional diet, meaning they have no seed oils, they have no animals raised on consuming corn and soy that can raise their omega-6, and they're not consuming nuts and seeds, right? Because virtually almost no populations do. So that's where we should be, is under 2% of our omega-6 consumption as linoleic acid. And again, that's what I have believed, for the past 4 years. And there's further evidence for this, but I won't go into that. Now, but we can just say that overall, westernized populations are anywhere from about 6% to 12% omega-6 linoleic acid. And as Paul already alluded to, so we accumulate the omega-6 in our fat, in other words, in our body fat, our adipose. We accumulate that in our cell membranes, in our mitochondrial membranes, and overall, this sets up an environment that's pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And so here, Paul has pulled up a graph where we're looking at, I think we should go to the previous one to this one, Paul, if we could for a second. Yeah, we go. So this is a graph looking at the percent of LA, linoleic acid, in our adipose versus the year. Now, this graph was prepared and published by Stefan Guillenet back in 2015, I think. And this represents 38 studies of the omega-6 linoleic acid in the body fat of Americans. And you can see that it averaged 9.1% in 1959 when we were a lot healthier, and it was at 21.5% in 2008. So that's collation of 37 studies. And again, so what I would submit is the higher your linoleic acid goes, the greater your risk. We should not be over. I'm absolutely convinced that ancestral levels of omega-6 linoleic acid would be about 3%, maybe 3.2%, possibly up to 4%. But we should never be over 4% omega-6 linoleic acid in our body fat, and probably under 3. And so roughly, and if you look at the data, whatever you consume in your food over, if you average that out over a 3-year period, you will approximately double that amount of LA in your body fat. Now, that's a rough estimate, and it doesn't work at the very lower end, and it may not work at the very high end. So, because there's probably threshold effects on both ends. But as a general rule, if you consume like Americans, when we're consuming in 2008, 11.8% omega-6 linoleic acid in our diet, our body fat, 21.5% omega-6 linoleic acid, right? It approximately doubles. And so it's a good rule of thumb. And as you've mentioned, so the omega-6 linoleic acid, the half-life in our body fat is roughly 600 to 680 days. The total turnover in one study was shown that you can turn over all of your body fat in 3 years. So this is pretty good news. I mean, it's a long target, but it's good news that it doesn't take 8 or 10 years necessarily to get back to ancestral levels. So if you have 21.5% of your body fat as omega-6 linoleic acid today, and you go on a completely ancestral diet and you get your omega-6 consumption down to 1%, and for the next 3 years, in 3 years, you should theoretically be down to around 3% or less omega-6 linoleic acid in your body fat. That is, to me, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself.
And just so people have some actionable steps here, the most important thing would be to eliminate seed oils from your diet. And we'll talk more in this podcast about mechanisms and evidence that these are harmful for humans. We've pretty much made the case of a correlation so far and evolutionary inconsistency in their consumption. But I want to talk about a few more pieces of evidence that point to their very problematic nature for humans. We talked about the breakdown products, specifically carboxymethyl pyrrol, but there are others. And so eliminating the seed oils from your diet is probably the most important first step. These are things: corn oil, canola oil, sunflower, safflower, soybean, etc. This is why I do this content on social media. And I say, hey, look, so many things in the grocery store that are labeled as healthy or vegan or plant-based or low fat, maybe not the low fat stuff so much, but so many of these things in the grocery store are going to have seed oils in them. They are the predominant oil in the food supply because they're cheap. They have some sort of a preservative effect. And so if you're not reading the labels on your food, you are almost certainly getting seed oils. When you go to restaurants, this is the next level for people who want to go to the next level. You need to know what your food is cooked in. A lot of things that are sauteed or cooked on in pans are going to be cooked in seed oils. A lot of restaurants are under the impression that people want canola oil. As I've spoken about in the past, McDonald's cooks their French fries in a series of oils. McDonald's French fries are actually cooked in 19. They have 19 ingredients, and I'm going to talk about French fries in a moment with acrolein, but they're cooked in 4 different types of seed oils: corn, canola, soybean, and partially hydrogenated soybean oil. So McDonald's French fries are cooked in 4 different seed oils. Five Guys fries are cooked in peanut oil. There are no French fries on the market other than maybe an amazing burger place here or there that has grass-fed burgers. It's going to cook their potatoes in tallow. I do have some reservations about oxalates in potatoes. That's a whole separate podcast, lectins in general. But in terms of what you're cooking your potatoes in, if you absolutely must eat French fries, tallow is the thing to do it in. And almost nowhere will do that. There are a few places that do. But even when I was in Arizona, I went to Smashburger, and they told me when I asked, they were cooked in tallow. And we did some research, and they're actually cooked in a combination of tallow and canola oil. So they weren't totally forthcoming. And I think the woman who told me just didn't know the answer, but it's hard to find French fries cooked in this stuff. So heating oils, especially seed oils, is problematic for humans. Know what your food is cooked in at the restaurant. I've done content around this. If you ask restaurants, they will either avoid the seed oils or they'll cook in something else for you, preferably butter. That's going to be a big step in the right direction, but you need to know where it's happening. Then, olive oil has about 15% linoleic acid, as does avocado oil, which is why I'm not a fan of those oils. So they're better than seed oils, which will go anywhere from 25 to 65% linoleic acid, but they're still more than tallow and butter, which are 1 to 2% linoleic acid in tallow and butter. I'm much more a fan of animal fats. If you've done all those things, getting rid of nuts in your diet will significantly decrease your consumption of linoleic acid. And then the last thing, which is actually kind of an interesting thing, and then I'll throw it back to you, Chris, in a moment, is that a lot of mainstream eggs are produced with diets of corn and soy, and that increases the amount of linoleic acid in those eggs. And you actually have data about this in your book, which I thought was really cool. Our friends, Sarah and Ashley Armstrong, have a farm called Angel Acres, and they've actually done research on the linoleic acid content of the yolks in their eggs. And they're raising their chickens very intentionally with a diet that's low in high linoleic acid grains. And they can show that if you feed a chicken different foods, you can reduce the amount of linoleic acid in the egg yolks. So when I did a recent post on Instagram about my fridge tour. Actually, I think it was a YouTube video. People said, "Where are the eggs in your fridge? How could you not eat eggs?" And the main reason I don't eat eggs is because I don't raise my own chickens. And I don't want to be eating eggs that are fed corn or soy or any grains that are high in linoleic acid. I'm eating liver, and I'm eating desiccated liver from hardened soil in our supplements. And so I don't see a unique need for an egg yolk if I'm eating liver. And I want egg yolks from chickens that are fed bugs and meat and, kitchen scraps, which will mostly be fruit because I don't eat vegetables. So I just want to give people that path. And then we threw out a couple numbers there that are a little complex for people, but I think the goal is to have the lowest amount of linoleic acid in your diet possible. And when I do my chronometer with my daily diet, it's around 1.3 or 1.4% of my calories are coming from linoleic acid. And I think that, what would you say is a goal, Chris? 3% linoleic acid in your diet is the threshold, or 2.5? People can put their diet into chronometer and see how much linoleic acid. People are not going to be able to measure the linoleic acid in their adipose tissue. That's just difficult for anyone.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the goal would be under 2% of your calories as omega-6 linoleic acid. And so if you're consuming 2,250 calories a day, let's say, that comes out to almost precisely 5 grams of linoleic acid. But, when you think about the typical person today on an average standard American diet as of 2008, and it may be higher now, but it's probably relatively the same, 29 grams a day, right? So if you get anywhere close to 5 grams of LA per day, you're probably going to be way better off than you were. But that definitely would be the goal. And you have to look at all these things like the eggs. And I do consume eggs, I would not, like you, Paul, I wouldn't consume any eggs that are coming from chickens that are consuming corn and soy, because that will drive their LA up a lot. And, LA gets concentrated in eggs. So you can get too much, you can drive your omega-6 consumption, I think, too high pretty quickly. If you're consuming 4 eggs a day that are CAFO raised, you'll get around 4 or 5 times more LA than you would with these ancestral eggs. The number that sticks in my head, and I don't have this in front of me, but I think in the Angel Acres eggs that are, they're not fed corn or soy, and they're out on pasture, I think they had 0.17 grams of LA per egg. So if I remember right, so what would that be? You're pushing, 0.7 grams ballpark in 4 eggs. So even if you ate 4 eggs a day, that's only 0.7 grams of the total 5 grams that you're trying to get in a day. So but you can, like that, you're not going to find that in chronometer, because that kind of evidence is not there. So you have to, but this is in my book. We've got all that kind of data, and the data on, non-corn and soy fed chicken and pork, pigs, versus ancestrally raised chicken and pigs, for example. So all those things need to be taken into consideration if you're trying to get, very low in your omega-6 linoleic acid. And I think it's critically important to do this. It's the most important thing you can do for your health.
Yeah, I found the graph in your book. It says in the ancestral eggs, quote unquote, which is coming from Angel Acres, you have 176 milligrams of linoleic acid per egg. And then pasture raised egg, 465 milligrams of linoleic acid per egg. A cage-free egg, 585 milligrams of linoleic acid per egg. And a CAFO egg, 734 milligrams of linoleic acid per egg. Does that sound right, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah. So significantly different depending on what type of egg you are eating and what the chickens are eating. Now, the intention is not to make it impossible for people to eat any food. The intention is just to share knowledge. And this is also why I tend to avoid chicken fat and pork fat from chickens and pigs that are fed corn and soy. The same thing happens in all monogastric animals. Humans are monogastric animals. We accumulate polyunsaturated fatty acids, and it takes 2 to 3 years to turn over our fat stores and change the amount of linoleic acid in our fat, and so do chickens and pigs. So a lot of people love bacon. Bacon is great, and I know I'll get comments on this podcast, people saying, I'm never going to give up eating my bacon. Great, eat your bacon. I'm just giving you information. Knowledge is power. Do know better, do better. But if you're eating bacon, chances are, unless you raise that pig, that pork fat can have a significant amount of linoleic acid in it. I think I've seen numbers more than 10% or maybe even 15% of that pork fat can be linoleic acid versus a wild pig or hog, which has around 4 to 5% linoleic acid. I've shared those data in the past. The same thing happens with chickens. Chicken fat can get very enriched in linoleic acid, 15 plus percent, 20% linoleic acid versus a wild chicken, which I don't see that much, perhaps in Hawaii, 4 to 5% linoleic acid. So it's very interesting, and it comes at us from all angles as humans. Again, start with seed oils. Start with what's in your food from restaurants. I know a lot of people eat the majority of their food from restaurants. So know what's in your food, then think about nuts and seeds and or the quality of the meats you're eating. This is why I'm a big fan of ruminant animals like beef, bison, goat, sheep, lamb, because if the animals are ruminant, if it has cloven hooves, then it doesn't accumulate linoleic acid in the same way. So even if a cow is fed grains, which is not ideal, it will still have around 2% linoleic acid in its fat because these animals can interconvert. They can saturate polyunsaturated fats, remove double bonds. We can't do that. Pigs can't do that. Chickens can't do that. And so this is interesting in the food chain. And this reminds me of an interesting picture that you have in your book, Chris, that I'll show here.
Yeah. So the reason we're looking at this slide is because I'm pausing here, Paul, because I'm thinking about the people that would just be listening to this. So we have a picture of a little boy who, I don't know, he must be 7 or 8 years old or something like that, who's smoking a cigarette, which is almost any parent or anybody would be stopped dead in their tracks if they saw that. And then to the right of that, we see a little tiny boy who's probably 2, who's roughly who's eating from a big plate of French fries. And of course, everybody would think that the kid eating the French fries that's kind of normal. We just think of that as rather normal. But both of these, the cigarettes, when you burn tobacco, you produce a chemical called acrolein. Well, guess what? That's one of those advanced lipid oxidation end products. And it happens to be the same advanced lipid oxidation end product that ends up in vegetable oil. And primarily because that oil is either, especially when it's heated, but also you will produce that in your body, because you can those can break down into acrolein. Well, so now I don't remember specifically the exact numbers, Paul, here, but the evidence shows that like a large French fries, this came from Martin Greutfeld's research, who looked at heated oils that comes from restaurants. If you take a large French fries, which cooked in that prolonged heated oil, that will contain about 1 to 1.5 milligrams of acrolein. Again, now acrolein is the toxicant of cigarette smoke, which is considered the most carcinogenic and toxic part of the cigarette, what you're getting from the cigarette. Okay, so 1 to 1.5 milligrams. So I did the math on this, and it turns out that the acrolein in a large French fries is the equivalent of smoking 18 to 26 average cigarettes, or up to 97 cigarettes that are lowest in acrolein. So, and back to the first picture. So the point is, so cigarettes, basically, they cause harm, we think, primarily because of their oxidative potential. Now you get these toxicants like acrolein and all these other chemicals, but their primary harm probably comes from oxidation. But that ends at about 6 months after you stop smoking. So I mean, probably be a very short time if you just smoked a few cigarettes, right? But when you consume French fries, those oils are going to deposit in your body fat unless you can burn it right away that day. They're going to be deposited in your body fat. And we know that ultimately, as we've talked about, that whatever you consume, whatever fatty acids you consume in your diet will be reflected in your body fat. And that takes 3 years to turn over. So what I showed here is that this little tiny boy is poisoned for 3 years after consuming this big plate of French fries, right? So if it were up to me, I think that smoking is fantastically safer than consuming vegetable oils, especially heated vegetable oils like you get in fast food restaurants that, where they're cooking these, the French fries in these oils that have been heated for days.
So perhaps we'll just clarify that I don't think you're advocating for smoking. It's just we're drawing the
Absolutely not.
comparison.
Just a comparison. No, I'm very, I've always been wanted to be very healthy and fit and all that. I grew up as an athlete. I've always considered myself athletic. And, but the point is that, modern medicine teaches us, right, Paul, that, in medical school, we're taught that, the really bad things are just smoking and drinking and maybe not getting any exercise. And that's about it, right? They don't, there's no talk at all about the diet or any of this, right? And I'm just drawing the connection here, the parallel, the comparison, maybe I should say, that consuming vegetable oils to me is fantastically more dangerous than smoking cigarettes because, again, you're accumulating these oils in your entire body and setting up your entire body for this pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic environment.
Yeah. And I remember in my life, when I smoked my first cigarette, I must have been 12 years old. And I was with my friends who were skaters and they were a bad influence on me. I was also a skater. I wore Airwalks and skids pants and I learned to ollie. And I don't think I ever did a kickflip, but I tried. And I smoked a cigarette. And ironically, I also ate a hamburger from McDonald's at the same time.
Yeah.
And then I smoked half of another one later in the day. And midway through the second cigarette, I thought, I don't want to be a smoker. And I threw it away and I never smoked another cigarette. But my family would always give me junk food. And I don't think that they were negligent. It's just they didn't know any better, even though my father is a physician. We had TV dinners and he would buy me burgers and I'm sure I ate fries. And if I told my family that I had French fries for lunch with my dad, and I told them that I smoked a cigarette with my friends who were skaters, they would be much more mortified about the cigarette than they would about the French fries. And this is just our gap in knowledge as humans and how many of us feed these foods to our children or don't know that these things are in our foods. And how ironic also, Chris, and I've done some content on this, that almost every baby formula I've ever seen in the grocery store, even those that are marketed as healthy or alternative or goat milk formulas, contain seed oils because we are trying to match the amount of linoleic acid in the breast milk of mothers. Well, imagine that. If we're eating more linoleic acid and our fat contains more linoleic acid, then our breast milk contains more linoleic acid. So I believe there are studies about this. You may know the breast milk of American mothers is very different in linoleic acid content than that of indigenous pregnant nursing mothers. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. It's a lot higher. I don't remember the numbers. I don't know if you know those offhand, Paul, but just like everything else, the linoleic acid goes way up in monogastric animals or humans. When we consume more omega-6, it goes much higher in the breast milk. But again, but in the comparison, but even that breast milk is so much healthier than these formulas. In fact, in the formulas, they're even ones that would start out with milk, they're removing or powdered milk, whatever. They're removing the butter or any natural animal fats that might be in there, and they're replacing those with vegetable oil. I know Sally Fallon from the Weston A. Price Foundation said many years ago that I remember her saying that formula is the single most processed food on the planet. This is what we're starting our kids off with. And we wonder, I remember, and I think about, a number of years ago that Robert Lustig said, well, any hypothesis that you want to proffer about obesity needs to explain why we have obesity in our infants nowadays. I mean, they don't diet and they don't exercise, was his argument. Why are they obese? And why are they so fat? And here's exactly why. The first thing we're giving them, so many mothers they're also not even breastfeeding. And the first thing they give them is formula. And the formula is made out of vegetable oils and sugar and maybe some refined flours, and then they just throw in a bunch of minerals and some vitamins. That's what it is. It's single most processed. I agree with Sally Fallon. Single most processed food there is, and this is exactly why we're causing obesity in our infants and our toddlers, because this is how we start them off eating.
And there is research correlating linoleic acid consumption in mothers and levels of obesity in children. So this has all been documented, that moms who eat more linoleic acid have more obese kids. Again, it's a lot of correlations, but I think that the correlations are so numerous and so strong that we cannot ignore this. And I guess the point of all this is just that I hope that really tight research will be done in the future so we can put this issue to rest, because there are confusions and people will say it's correlation, it's not causation. Exactly. We need to do some solid research to really prove how horrible these are for humans. I've talked on previous podcasts about all the interventional studies in the past, Minnesota coronary, LA veterans. I don't think we need to belabor that point on this podcast. But again, the seed oil discussion is complex. So one thing that I don't think you and I have talked about on a previous podcast is cardiolipin, Chris. And I want to make sure we cover this. And then I know our time is dwindling. And after that, I want to make sure we get to Japan and really talk about some of the most compelling epidemiology we have looking at sugar versus seed oils in terms of driving obesity. But let's start with cardiolipin. What is it? Why does it matter? And how does this play into the linoleic acid story?
Yeah, sure. So cardiolipin is a type of molecule that primarily exists in the inner mitochondrial membranes, and it is a molecule that contains 4 what are called acyl tails. These are fatty acid tails that they vary a little bit depending on what organ they come from. But if you look at in the heart, they generally come from linoleic acid, interestingly enough. But this cardiolipin it has to interdigitate with other molecules of cardiolipin in the inner mitochondrial membrane in order to hold the proton charge, essentially. So when we create energy, we have to, in our inner mitochondria, our powerhouses of our cells, we have to create energy through ATP. And the way we do that is we first build a proton gradient inside the inner mitochondrial membrane. And those protons, which are basically hydrogen atoms, they have to be held in place through this membrane that's solid. But if you consume a high omega-6 diet, what happens is this begins what I call a catastrophic lipid peroxidation cascade. And one of the things that gets oxidized in that is the linoleic acid that is in the cardiolipin. And then those tails can no longer fit together properly because either the LA is oxidized, or when it's oxidized, it'll be replaced by other molecules like DHA, which is the docosahexaenoic acid, or arachidonic acid, AA. And either way, if they're replaced, now those molecules don't fit together properly. They have this 3D conformational change, and now you can create pores, leaky spots in that inner mitochondrial membrane where the hydrogen protons can leak through. And if they leak through, now they can no longer create energy because they normally are going to come through the ATP synthase, and that hydrogen proton is going to provide the energy to phosphorylate ADP to ATP. Now you've lost that. And so this is where, and we know this happens. We know that on a very short-term diet of high omega-6 in rodents, that the cardiolipin will go down to 1/10 of, I think it's 1/10 or 1/5 of what it was. So it's destroyed, really. And in the process, you destroy the energy making capability of the mitochondria because you've broken down the electron transport chain, which is where all this exists. Now that's a very complicated to try to explain without images and all that, but there's a mechanism behind this that all makes sense. And when you cause this energy failure in this way, when the cell can't properly make energy, the cell begins to fall apart. We need energy to do all cellular functions there are, right? And this is, I think, number one is now you've paralyzed cellular processes. You also cannot properly burn fat for fuel, is what I believe. And so then you'd actually begin to store, lipid droplets in the cell that can no longer properly be burned for fuel because they can't run through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain properly. So this may be one of the reasons that we see, these lipid droplets accumulating in the liver and in the retina and in the brain and all that. We're wondering why all this is, but I think it's, ultimately toxicity from the high omega-6 diets that's driving this. So that's basically the story of cardiolipin. And there is definitely more detail that, we get into. There is another proposed mechanism for this. But the bottom line is we know that cardiolipin there's a destructive process to cardiolipin in high omega-6 diets, and that will create energy failure, and it will create things like congestive heart failure in 3 weeks of a high omega-6 diet in animals.
And isn't there evidence that when babies are born, their cardiolipin looks different than it does in most westernized adults in terms of the population, like in terms of these 4 acyl tails and the amount of linoleic acid that as we age, it can become enriched in linoleic acid in people that are eating more high linoleic acid diets?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that specifically in comparing babies to adults or whatever. I don't know the answer to that, Paul.
Maybe I heard Tucker talk about that. I'll have to circle back to Tucker Goodrich, but I feel like we talked about that on a previous podcast with Tucker Goodrich, and the fact that if you look at a baby's cardiolipin, it's very different than a westernized adult's cardiolipin in terms of the population of the linoleic acid in those tails. And so it's interesting because this represents a potential mechanism by which linoleic acid may be causing problems at the level of mitochondria and these inner membranes. Mitochondria have 2 membranes. The story that many people believe is that mitochondria are these primordial bacteria that some sort of cell engulfed, and they've become symbiotic with us. They're symbionts now, and that's why they have 2 membranes. And anyway, this is where the foods that are eaten are broken down. Essentially, the nutrients from the foods are translated into actual usable energy for humans at the level of mitochondria. So something that disrupts this inner mitochondrial membrane could cause massive problems for humans at a lot of different levels. And there's compelling evidence for this. I'll also add that we don't have to go into this today, but the animal literature with linoleic acid is almost incontrovertible. It's unequivocal that linoleic acid is harmful for animals. Unfortunately, it's much more difficult to do controlled studies in humans. But if you look at rats and mice, it's very, very clear that feeding rats and mice higher linoleic acid diets leads to all sorts of problems, myriad issues in these animals with these. As I said earlier, some of the interventional studies with linoleic acid in humans are confounded by problems with the control groups. Nobody has done an interventional study with linoleic acid in the last 50 to 60 years, as far as I'm aware. Isn't that true, Chris? Like, no one's actually repeated any of those studies.
Absolutely. And in my way of viewing this, Paul, I think that these studies will never, ever, ever be done, in my view, because, the longest studies I've ever seen where diets were completely controlled were 6 months. You tell me if you see a diet, because again, you've got to put these people into a metabolic ward. You got to control everything they eat. It's got to be, tracked, measured. It's extraordinarily expensive. And I haven't seen one that tracked, an entire diet for more than 6 months. Most of them are just a few weeks at most. This is in people. So, I mean, all these other studies, they tried to change one thing, like the ones you'd mentioned, the LA American Veterans Trial, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, and they try to change one thing about the diet, but you've got a million confounders really in all those too. And you're starting off with all these studies, you're starting off with people that already have, like, if you take a bunch of 40-year-old, male Americans and you try to randomize them, well, you're going to have people with really high omega-6 in their diet. And you're going to have people with really low, potentially like you and me. Right. But that takes 3 years, before you actually change the most important thing, which is the omega-6 in your body fat and in your cell membranes, right? So it's just like if you're trying to figure out what causes lung cancer, and you take people that, you take a group from all of which were smokers, right? But some just smoked more than others, right? And now you randomize them into different groups and run a trial for a few years, right? What can you learn from that? And this is why I am so invested in the evidence that comes from observational studies. That's what these are, that I do primarily. I look at what's happened in people, in populations, over very long periods of time. It's really what Weston Price did. It's observational, but you can look at the data as a whole for the entire population, like in our case, for up to 150 years, and then look at what happened to those people in terms of outcomes. And you're never going to see this happen, with any long-term randomized controlled clinical trials. And if you did, then you have the problem of that a lot of these conditions that we're intensely interested in, cardiovascular disease, stroke, a lot of the cancers, macular degeneration, the incubation period for these diseases is 4 decades and longer, right? How many people do we see have heart attacks before age 40, or macular degeneration before age 40? How about Alzheimer's disease? So in other words, if you're going to run these studies, you need to run them for 4 decades. And you're going to have to completely control their diets, is the way I see it.
Cost.
So, we don't even, the LA American Veterans Trial, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, you got people coming in and out of the trials. You control one thing, you control some of the fat, and I think, and then you're trying to base your decision making based on very limited evidence and you have no idea the background of all these people, coming into these studies. That is extremely important. So that's why I don't put a lot of, there's just constant talk about all these studies, and the problem is the reason there is that most of them don't answer the question very well, and they're never going to.
It's very unfortunate. But I think that if I simplify it in my mind, most of us agree that quote unquote processed foods are probably the major driver of chronic illness in humans. The problem is that processed foods is kind of this hand-waving, non-specific term. What is a processed food? What is not a processed food? Processed foods tend to contain multiple ingredients, which could potentially be driving problems in humans. And this will wrap us into a discussion of Japan in a moment. So I was recently in Los Angeles, and I had the chance to hang out with a friend of mine, surprisingly, who's plant-based. And he and I will hopefully do a podcast at some point in the future and go back and forth and share our different opinions. His name is Simon Hill. And so we got to work out together at Gold's Gym in Venice. And it was about 30% working out and about 70% talking about studies between sets. And it was probably 2.5 hours of us talking. It wasn't recorded for people that are curious, but hopefully we will record something like that soon. I think that it's interesting. But one of my takeaways was that both Simon and I agree very clearly that processed foods are problematic for humans. And I'm interested in understanding what part of processed foods is harmful for humans so that we can scale that and give people something to really look for. If people just get rid of processed foods, their health will improve hands down. And it's kind of like, what a processed food is. Bag, labels. It's a cake, it's a cookie, it's candies, it's crackers. It's just processed foods. It's not something on the outside of the grocery store. It's not a piece of fruit. It's not a vegetable. It's not a meat. It's not tallow or butter or milk or cheese. Mostly everything else that I haven't listed are processed foods. And people might want to split hairs there. But what's interesting to me is that 2 of the main ingredients in processed foods people point to are sugar and seed oils. And so I think that all of the ingredients in processed foods, refined grains, flours, seed oils, sugars, potentially preservatives, glyphosate, gums, need to be considered for their potential to cause human harm. But if we just look at those 2 ingredients, sugar and seed oils, Those are the two that I think stick out the most to me. And a lot of people will point to sugar as problematic for humans. As I've spoken about in the past, there are a couple of definitions of sugar, whether we're talking about sucrose, cane sugar, or high fructose corn syrup. But some of this work that you've done, Chris, I think is quite compelling and very interesting, looking at this epidemiology, this observational research in places like Japan. But I think Japan and China are good examples of this. And looking at patterns of sugar consumption versus seed oil consumption, and then trying to correlate that with chronic illness. So you want to walk us through this? And I'll try and pull up some slides here.
Yeah, let's just leave that one there. And then I'll mention some other things that, that we'll talk about. So, all right. So for those people that are just listening, this is Japan's nutrition transition. And I think Japan is incredibly important for us to evaluate in terms of all of their foodstuffs and the outcomes of in terms of obesity, overweight, and chronic disease. And I'm gonna mention some numbers here that aren't necessarily on this slide, but this is if we just look at between approximately 1960 and 2004. First of all, the total calories went down 31% during this time in Japan. The carbohydrate consumption, which was 84% in 1960, when the nation was phenomenally healthy, went down to 56% by 2004. So that went down, carbohydrates went down 28%. Now, sugar was 198 calories in 1961. I think, and I don't have this number exactly, but it peaked around 329 calories in 1989. And then it trended downwards down to 283 calories by about 2004 is what happened with sugar. So sugar has been going down since 1989. And the saturated fat, just so everybody knows, is the lowest in the developed world at 7% in Japan. Even recently, that's their recent numbers. Seed oils, however, they went up between 1960 and 2004, 333%. That's 4.33 fold. They went from 9 grams a day in 1961 to 39 grams a day in 2004. All right. So let me just to broadly look at this. Calories are going down. Carbohydrates are going down. Sugars are going down after 1989. But the one thing going up is the vegetable oils and the omega-6. And we'll come back to the omega-6 in a minute. All right. So during this time, we see that male obesity doubled. It went from 16% in 1978 to 31.2% in 2010. Breast cancer went up about fivefold between 1975 and 1999. 4 cancers went up multifold in Japan. 4 different cancers. I don't remember exactly what those are. I don't have that handy. Diabetes went up between 1954 and 2007. Diabetes went up 345-fold. Went from 0.02% in 1954 to 6.9% in 2007. So 345-fold increase in diabetes. Macular degeneration went up 82-fold, went from 0.2% between 1975 and 1999 up to 16.37% in 2013. That's an 82-fold increase. So, but look at this, ladies and gentlemen. This is that you can see that the omega-6 was 1% of the calories back in 1961, when the seed oils were only 9 grams a day, right? And we end up at 7.8% by 2009. So the omega-6 went up 7.8 fold, right? So again, I think that's incredibly important to evaluate that. How could you design a study any better than that? I think it's the perfect study, and it covers roughly a 50, 60 year period.
It's very compelling correlations, and we didn't show other countries, but in your book you list the United States. Maybe I'll pull up the China graph here in a moment, which looks pretty similarly. These correlations are not just in Japan; it happens everywhere. And again, correlation is not causation. People will say, and it's true, but it's enough for us to say this is very concerning. This same sort of correlation between increased amount of omega-6 from seed oils, increasing all of our illnesses is happening. And in many countries, you see sugar declining while all of those diseases are occurring. And so I'm not advocating for high fructose corn syrup at all. That's different. I've spoken about that on other podcasts. I'm not convinced that sucrose is the worst thing in the world for humans. And I'm not advocating for that either, because I think there is a problem of there's not a lot of nutrients in high fructose corn syrup or in sucrose, but I think it begs an interesting question, which is, what is the real driver here? And I think that's important to really point out. All right, so I wanted to pull up China as well to compare so that people can see that these correlations occur in multiple countries. You want to walk through this one real quick, Chris, and then we'll wrap up for you?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think China is incredibly important to look at as well, because they have exceedingly low sugar consumption. It is the 8th lowest sugar consumption in the world. And anybody who, if you're looking at this graph, or if you're not, I'll describe it, but you can see that sugar is in the green curve there, and it has been ranging from about 60 to 80 calories per day in China since about 1980s. And so that is 2.5% of their calories on average. So it's virtually just almost negligible, right? And it's not changing. And but you can see that the vegetable oils in China have increased from 30 calories per day, which would be 3 grams, essentially, 3.1 or 3.2 grams back in 1961 in the blue curve there, right? And goes all the way up to, so by 2018, vegetable oils were 204 calories per day. So vegetable oils went up 7-fold during this time frame of approximately, this is almost, you're pushing 60 years here, right? This is like 57 years or so. Right. Well, so what happened to them? Well, if you're looking at the graph, you can see that their overweight and obesity, that is the red curve, and the combined overweight and obesity climbed from a total of 15.3% back in 1991, I think it was, all the way to combined total of 42% overweight and obese by around 2014, I think it is. And then their cancer incidence, basically, this is incidence, increased from 495 per 100,000 back in about 1991 up to 1,587 per 100,000 by 2017, I think it was. And so the cancer, it went up 3.2-fold. Obesity went up 3-fold. And a couple other things I'll mention that are not on this graph. Cardiovascular disease went up 15% just between 1990 and 2017. And very interestingly, lung cancer went up 465%, while the smoking prevalence went from 27%, I'm pretty sure it was, down to 20%. And I'm almost dead sure those numbers are correct. But as we've talked about before, and Tucker Goodrich talked about several years ago, is that, there was the concern about smoking or lack of smoking and lung cancer in China. This is it. This is what you're seeing right here. Even all these cancers go up in the face of higher omega-6 consumption. In this case, it's coming once again, coming from the vegetable oils, as you see right here.
And Chris, did I read in your book, or maybe it was somewhere else, maybe it was in one of Tucker's blogs, but that in countries where there is no seed oil consumption, there is no correlation between smoking and lung cancer. Have you heard this?
I have witnessed, the equivalent of that multiple times. Weston Price talked a lot about the fact that the population of Scotland and the Outer Hebrides that lived in those smoke-filled huts, that they were exposed to this smoke day in, because they didn't use chimneys. They let the smoke pour into their huts, and they just removed the thatched roofs every summer, and they used it as fertilizer. But anyway, they weren't getting lung disease. They weren't getting tuberculosis anyway. And there was no evidence that they were getting lung cancer. The Pacific Islanders, very interestingly, some of those, they smoke like crazy down there. And yet in those populations, like the Papua New Guineans, they would get pneumonia, but there's no discussion of them having COPD or lung cancer. I haven't seen any evidence of that at all. And yet they smoke like crazy. So again, I think, when you have an ancestrally appropriate diet and you've avoided vegetable oils and you're consuming lots of nutrients, you're very, very well protected from cancer. And, I think Georgi Dinkov mentioned this to you, that and I've seen the same thing. All of these cancer researchers, they know if they want to create cancer in a laboratory animal, they generally cannot just give them a carcinogen like DMBA or irradiate them. They need to give them the higher omega-6 diet. Otherwise, they cannot reliably produce cancer at all. So you've got to get that omega-6 up, and you need to get it above 4.4% in the diet. And that's what all westernized countries are above that threshold. They're all above that. All of them.
Yeah. As we mentioned earlier, the animal studies are very, very concerning. And I think the parallels for humans are very likely there. But the cancer connection, the cardiovascular disease connection, and with Tucker and Jeff, I talked a lot about cardiovascular disease and LDL and its propensity to oxidize when you're eating more linoleic acid. I mean, there's so many things we didn't have a chance to talk about today, but thanks for coming on the podcast, Chris. Thank you for your work. Where can people find more of your stuff and get the book?
Yeah, Paul, thank you for having me on. So first of all, you can get the book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, almost wherever books are sold online. We have two foundations, Cure AMD Foundation and Ancestral Health Foundation. Those are cureamd.org and ancestralhealthfoundation.org. The latter of those is in the works. So that won't be available immediately, but will be soon, the Ancestral Health Foundation website. We do also have Facebook pages and Instagram pages for those. And you can see me on podcasts like this. That's basically it, Paul.
All right. Well, thank you, man. It's good to see you again. And I hope that eventually a lot of people hear about this and turn the tide. What's encouraging for me is that when I'm out in the world these days traveling, some people see me and they say, "Hey, you're the meat guy," but other people see me and they go, "Seed oils are bullshit." And so it's making an impact. I was at Erewhon in Los Angeles. I'm doing a smoothie with them next month in July. We're launching the smoothie July 7th at Erewhon in Los Angeles. It's a carnivore. It's not a carnivore, but it's like an animal-based raw smoothie with raw kefir and a bunch of fruit and honey. It's really going to be good. And I was in the parking lot of Erewhon talking to a friend, and in the span of 15 minutes, at least 6 people walked by and said, "Hey, what's up, man? I love your work." And I thought, wow, that's really cool. But multiple people drove by in their cars and said, like, "Seed oils, get rid of the seed oils, fuck seed oils." And I thought, wow, the message is getting out. People are getting it. So that's pretty cool. So thanks for the work you do.
It all starts with a small group of committed people, right?
Yeah.
A small group of committed people can change the whole world. And that's what we're doing. We're doing this together. Right? So I appreciate it, Paul. You're doing such fabulous work all the time. So my hat's off to you all the time.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see you. And until next time.